How's it going, y'all? It's your boy Raymond back up in here with another review video. And today we've got kind of a dense one for you. Today we are going to be talking about The Apprentice. I know there's going to be a lot of discourse and possible controversy about this film, so I just kind of wanted to address the elephant in the room just kind of straight out the gate. Yes, this is a film about Donald Trump and also Roy Cohn, but it is not what you think it probably is. In fact, I think if anything, this is just going to be one of those films that is in general going to be kind of a tough sell for some people. And let me explain why. For one, for the people who maybe are, big Trump supporters or whatever, or who see him in a good light, I think a lot of those people are just going to naturally be turned off by the idea of like a Trump villain arc biopic. But I wouldn't even necessarily say that the film is that. It definitely has its own angle on things, but I'll get into that later. And then also for people who are anti-Trump, I think just the idea of even portraying him as a person and really humanizing him as like a public figure, I think a lot of like anti-Trump supporters are just going to be really turned off by that idea. So it's kind of going to be a tough sell for for like a lot of people, and it kind of begs the question like who is this film like necessarily for? And I think it's kind of how open-minded are you to the concept of this kind of film and diving into this subject matter. For me personally, I'm just going to give like my thoughts as to why I think the film is fairly justified with it coming out, and why I think this kind of film is really something that people could find interesting if they give it a try. They've been trying to release this for a while now. However, the Trump campaign actually broke some headlines because they had attempted to stop the film from being released for like the past 3 or 4 years or something like that. So this film has been in the pipeline for quite a while, and it's been meaning to come out just from the resistance of Trump's campaign, pushing back against it, trying every which way to stop it from coming out, and clearly not succeeding, because this is coming out literally in October, which is a month away from, voting day. So it's really coming out at quite a pivotal moment in not only the election, but just at this point in time. If this came out around the time when they wanted it to come out originally, we might be having a different conversation, but for it to come out at this time really kind of feels fairly orchestrated and rather on purpose, rather than being sort of this, biopic of a villain type of deal. I think what I enjoy most about this film is just the fact that it is trying to have more of a nuanced conversation, not only about Trump, but also just about this idea of the American system and the idea of media, just how these kind of figures really can thrive in a place like this under these rules and these guidelines, and the idea of like the American dream, and how all of this can really kind of be dangerous and breeds a lot of the characters that we see in this film. And so with that being said, let me just address right off the bat sort of the angle that the film is taking, not only on its characters, but just in the style that it's portraying a lot of these events. The film actually takes rather more apolitical stance on a lot of the subjects, and it more focuses on this idea of power dynamics and the idea of this arc of a character who, starts from like this, very low place and slowly rises to become something greater, but in the framework of, this real life circumstance with these real life characters, and in a time and place that is very specific to American history. I'm, of course, talking about 70s and 80s New York City. And so the style really does an interesting job of attempting to use this documentary handheld, like camcorder style, to sort of almost serve as like a reflection of the media at the time, and also sort of just pointing the finger to like the audience in a way of like, here's like a lot of what this looked like at the time, and it's almost pointing the finger back at the audience saying like, this isn't necessarily something that is unusual, this kind of character and these kinds of people. This is something that has been bred and has been ingrained in sort of this idea of the American system and how the media plays a big part in the portrayal of a lot of these people. And so this kind of gets established pretty much from like the very beginning. There's like this montage of credits with like punk rock music playing in the background and these different, shots of New York City and everything like that. Until we finally land on, a young Donald Trump played by Sebastian Stan in a club. And this look is fairly consistent throughout like the entire film. It doesn't ever really look like the film ever switches to this highly processed HDR, 4K resolution, Panavision, whatever kind of look, because it still stays in that lane of like, hey, like this is a product of the 70s and 80s. And if you were living in the 70s and 80s at this time and watching like a documentary or watching TV or something, this is what that look would look like. Just the graininess of like the TV cameras and like the weird grain of these camcorder cameras. A lot of it is very stylized, but it's also very consistent throughout the entire film and really gives it this specific look and this like grittiness to it that I don't think a lot of other directors would take risks with like this, but I'll get to the director's influences in a little bit here. So we essentially start with a young Donald Trump on a date in 70s New York. He's this, like scrawny, kind of timid sort of character with obviously his classic, hair top and everything like that. Really eager to try and make it in the world, but he just doesn't really know how. And he sort of is still functioning under the guise of his father, Fred Trump. Fred Trump, who at the time was a huge real estate mogul and was really making a name for himself, forming this empire kind of thing. And, his name was fairly well known around New York City, not only with real estate, but with a lot of like upper class people at the time. And so what Donald's motives are essentially is trying to follow in the footsteps of his father, but still remains in the shadows of that kind of legacy and is attempting to sort of pivot around sort of like the guise of his father so that he can try and do something for himself and just do something that would be worthwhile without having any sort of influence from his father. But obviously, where we're starting, he's at a low. He's not nearly at like the Trump Tower, $1 billion casino level yet. And so he struggles talking with women, and we see him on a date in the first scene, and he's struggling on the date. Always wants to talk about himself, doesn't really quite know how to carry or sell himself, and hasn't created that facade, that mask that we really know him for today. He also has a habit of just going to bars alone and just sitting there watching and observing people from like the corner of the room. It's really interesting, but I like that's like a little added touch for him. So finally, he's approached by one of Roy Cohn's men, and one of I guess like either his security guard or like his personal assistant, I don't know, like one of his guys. And he just happens to be in the bar with a bunch of his business associates. And so he goes over and invites Donald over to have like a drink, but Donald doesn't drink. But he like basically, forces him to drink and get into the habit of things. Tries to ask him about, like, who are you? Like, what are you up to? Like, what are you doing? Everybody seems to be having like a good time, and they're just on a completely different wavelength than Donald. But that's sort of the point, making him almost feel like a little bit alienated. But Roy definitely sees something in him that is interesting, and that he sees like some kind of drive in him, and that'll carry him forward throughout the rest of the story. I am talking about, of course, the infamous Roy Cohn, played by Jeremy Strong here, who just gives an incredible performance as Roy Cohn. The guy is just batshit. He's intimidating. He's psychotic. He is just overall kind of like the perfect real life villain. And he is just a bastard of a man, but Jeremy Strong does an absolutely brilliant job portraying him here, and he is hilarious and entertaining throughout the entire film. So from here on out, Roy essentially takes Donald under his wing and immediately just starts like showing him the ropes of how this game called life works, and just gives him like a ton of these tips and tricks on how to win, essentially. And he establishes fairly early on that, you know, there's this code that he lives by that eventually Donald will live by. This idea that there are two people in this world. There are killers and then there are losers. You know, he essentially gives Donald like a lot of this advice and crafts this world view that will forever stick with him as the story goes on. Is really kind of interesting to see how quickly he takes him under his wing. He sort of sees himself in Donald in some sort of way, I think. In some sort of way, I think he wants that sort of companionship, and he wants somebody who's on his level, who's somebody who's like going to be almost like his successor in some sort of way, which I think is an interesting dynamic to have on the both of them. Roy takes him around like his own lap dog, and Donald is there like at his beck and call. And it's almost like this extended montage of just them doing like all this stuff, and Roy explaining how the game works and how a lot of these people function, and who he needs to meet, the different people that he has to get in pockets with, the different people who should owe him money or who he shouldn't owe money to, the people that he should meet just in case that shit goes south, and, you know, lawyers and just all these different people. And it's crazy to think that everybody was just in somebody's pocket at the time. In New York City, everybody was in some sort of way connected. And Roy himself is rather an interesting character. I mean, he has like a weird like frog doll collection, which is very interesting. I know that was like an infamous quirk of his that people knew about. I think the most interesting thing as well is that Roy Cohn was a closeted homosexual. And I think it's interesting to play with this idea that you have two people who put on this facade and put on this mask for the public in order to create this vision of power. But yet these are two people who I think really just want to be accepted into society. And Roy's version of being accepted into society is ruling over as many people as possible and trying to put on this facade of power, so that he can seem like he is not only one of the people, but one of the best people, if anything. And I think Trump essentially merges his way into that through Roy's philosophies. And so as we move throughout the film, Donald essentially starts to get more and more confident. He starts to try and adapt a lot of the Roy's teachings, and just, you know, try to do things himself without the guise of Fred of his father. Fred Trump eventually starts to kind of find out like what's going on. Donald tries to get Roy to defend them because, you know, the Trump estate is essentially being sued by the FBI for this building that they own for like ethical reasons. There's like, you know, they're being sued by a lot of their tenants for being racist and a lot of this stuff. And so Roy essentially helps do them a favor and get them out of being sued. And from then on, everything sort of snowballs, because not only does Fred Trump start to sort of trust this guy a little bit more, but then Donald starts to see the power that Roy really has and tries to incorporate that, and starts to believe that he could start, you know, moving these pieces almost like 3D real life chess. And so the overall timeline of the film, I would say, I think it's supposed to be from like the mid or to early 70s to like the mid to early 80s. The thing that I really, really appreciated also about the film is just the fact of how far out of its way it went to make New York City look like just a shithole. I think that's something that a lot of people wouldn't really, you know, understand if you hadn't lived there at this time period, about how New York City was broke in like the 70s and 80s. The way that it was being run, the city was like essentially crumbling in on itself. There was mass poverty. There was trash and garbage in the streets. Any of you who have seen like any documentaries or any films that were shot in New York in the 70s and 80s probably know what I'm talking about. The aesthetic of the city is so specific because of how gross and grimy it was back in the day. It's cool that the director, Ali Abbasi, sort of has this mix of this documentary style, but also mixing in footage from that time interlaced with a lot of the overhead like helicopter shots, as well as like a lot of like the montage scenes with the set design to make New York City look the way that it did, along with the documentary and along with the footage from that time period. And I think it works really well. And I think the style really works well, just complementing even more sort of the look of New York at this time. And throughout the film as well, there's like a lot of these reenactments of interviews and these different press media clippings that you would see at the time on TV of Trump, of Roy Cohn, of a lot of the other characters that we see later on. It's almost like mockumentary-esque. And I think it's really fun. I think it's like a really cool twist. And it's also a risk and a stylistic choice that I think not a lot of other people and not a lot of other directors would really make. And I think it looks and feels the way that it does because it's not made by somebody who is an American. Ali Abbasi, he is not American, obviously. Luckily, when I saw the film, there was also a Q&A with him as well. And he talked a lot about how, you know, he found the story so intriguing, but he's coming at it from an outsider perspective. He's not from the US, so he doesn't really have the same perspective on this story and these characters like we would, basically. And he found the story like really intriguing, and he wanted to make a film sort of about that. But his angle on it is really from the idea of the American system, the media, and how a lot of this stuff really plays a factor into how these people are portrayed. And it's sort of, he wanted to portray this as more of like, this is the system that made this person, you know, and this is really what he was born from, and more so pointing the finger at the audience and at you know, us, and basically going like, hey, like, you know, this isn't just, you know, somebody that came out of thin air. Like, this is somebody who is a, you know, cold-blooded American. And I think coming at it with that sort of perspective and that sort of angle is such an interesting viewpoint. I think that's why this film really speaks to me and actually has, like, you know, ground to stand on. Even with all this, and even with this, you know, this sort of different perspective and the style and all of this, I think where this film really is lacking is actually in, once you get into like the nitty-gritty of the dialogue, the characters, and just kind of like the story in general. I think I've heard from like a couple other peoples who saw this director's previous films that the writing tends to be like a little, you know, shallow, a little bit too, you know, on the nose for certain things. And I can definitely see it here. You know, you're spanning 10 years in this film, and you're trying to cram all of this into 2 hours, which I know 2 hours is 2 hours, but there's so much material that you're going through in this film, and such a pivotal like point in history, and it's so pulpy, and there's so much going on that is connected, and it's hard to cover like so much ground in the way that the film kind of struggles to really dive into these specific character interactions and these specific events in these people's lives without having to constantly jump onto the next thing. And I think the biggest piece that is really kind of lacking in this whole thing is really with the inclusion of Ivana. For anybody who knows like sort of the backstory on Trump, you know that Ivana was his first wife, and she was a big portion of sort of growing the Trump brand back in the 80s, and she actually just passed away, I think, like a couple of years ago as well. The depiction of their relationship sort of feels like a bit rushed. We meet them at first because Donald noticed that they were, her and her girlfriends were being kicked out of this party that Donald was at because Roy was hosting this big party full of like, you know, rich people and all these like famous celebrities and stuff, and Donald happened to be there, and they were trying to get into the party, but he saw something in her beauty or whatever, and wanted to get them into the party. So he did. And then he eventually takes her home, and they have like a moment, but she has a boyfriend already, but obviously it's Donald, like he doesn't care, you know, he's going to try to go after her anyways. At that point in the film, you know, he's really sort of gotten his footing, and he's really starting to grow his confidence. And Ivana almost feels like that next business endeavor in some sort of way, where he wants to reach that next goal, and he'll do whatever he can to really get there. They go back and forth, and he's trying to woo her. He like buys her all these flowers and all this stuff and has these surprises for her, but she eventually like says that she's going to get married. And he's just like, what? Well, you can't do that. And then she's doing like this modeling thing at this ski resort, and Donald just shows up to like impress her or convince her to not get married. And I guess it works, because she, I guess, calls off her marriage and they end up getting together, which is crazy. But, you know, we have to get to them actually getting together and getting married themselves. So we just skip past that whole bit, basically, you know, happily ever after, whatever. And now Donald is trying to get the plans put in place through the city to build Trump Tower. Donald really wants to live up to his father's expectation, and then also, you know, precede them and be the next successor to his father. So he wants to essentially build this giant tower, which we now know is Trump Tower, while New York is literally broke and losing money. And he essentially wants to put this luxury hotel right dab in the middle of New York. The mayor and everybody is going like, you're crazy. Like, who's going to pay for any of that? Why would they do that? But because of Roy, and because Roy knows people and has these connections and is very manipulative and has people in his pocket, he is able to convince the mayor to do it. So he gets the plans for Trump Tower, and they go through with it. And Ivana, because she's into fashion and because she's into design, essentially designs a lot of the interiors for Trump Tower. In a sense, their relationship actually is a lot more dynamic than you would think, which I thought was interesting, where, you know, she is also very much about money and power, but she also is very into fashion and design and all this stuff. So, you know, that's really her creative space, whereas Donald is very much into the real estate, you know, mogul area. But like I said before, you know, Ivana was really just more of like this business endeavor for himself. I think that's really how like I see their relationship, but she really saw it where she fell in love with him, and she wanted to have kids and grow old with him and have like this empire. But Donald, unfortunately, he fell into the power hungry mess that he became, and he just wanted more and more and more. And eventually their relationship just degrades to, she eventually just fades and becomes like a ghost in their own house. And she becomes like as irrelevant as like the Art Deco wallpaper in their mansion. And eventually he just sees her as like this, you know, object basically. And he even tells her in like a later scene that he just feels nothing for her anymore. And he just continues to go down this path where like everything is like a new business adventure. He has to conquer this thing, and you know, he doesn't see anybody as people anymore, and he sees them more as just things to rule over, or people that he can use at some point. What is your value to him? Is it, you know, your connections? Is it your money? Is it your status? You know, that's really how he starts to just see the people around him, and it eventually just evolves into that as he grows more confident and as he gains more power. And as their relationship really decays, you start to see the style of the film really take place with a lot of these, you know, sort of media camera style footage where, you know, you can see that they are both putting on this facade that they are this happy romantic couple, and that they are really this, you know, wealthy, rich, happy lifestyle kind of people. But really under the surface, this gives you like a good insight into what it was really like at the time. You start to really see how a lot of the media is portraying how these people really were, and why they're so interested in a lot of these celebrities and the idea of putting on these facades for television. And you have to remember as well, like this is at a time where social media did not exist, and TV and newspaper was really what controlled the narrative at the time. And so putting on these facades and, you know, being in bed with the media and with the newspapers was really something that was important, and that was something that Roy stressed to Donald very early on in the film as well. While, the film kind of does an interesting job of framing their relationship, I just don't feel like the connection is like quite where it needs to be for me. She just kind of, there's so much already going on that's established with Roy and with, his father and his family, and there's a lot of different character dynamics that are going on, and then she's just thrust into it like halfway through, and it's definitely an interesting addition to his story, and you can see how his confidence with women and how he treats women evolves. I just think it could have gone like a little bit further, and I think the film could have given her a little bit more justification for being there and for really what she was about outside of maybe just Trump. And again, like with everything else that is going on, her addition to the story just feels less significant than everything that is going on. And maybe that was a choice by the director to sort of go that route where she eventually just fades into the background of his life because we're seeing it through, Donald's perspective. I think that if the film really wanted to address the idea of sex and power dynamics, I think there's an interesting conversation to be had there just with their relationship. But unfortunately, there is so much ground that's being covered, and there is so much else going on between the other characters that, there's just not a whole lot that is as, tangible in their relationship compared to Roy's or with his family. And that sort of tends to be the main issue with a lot of this writing. Like I said, like a lot of it just comes off as like a little bit, too surface level. You're trying to cover so much ground in 2 hours, and, there's so many different little events that happened in this time period. Like him and Ivana get together, and then they get married, and then they have kids, and then he starts to grow his empire, and then they eventually get divorced. And there's just so much that happens. Roy eventually grows old, and then Roy is dying of AIDS, but won't, admit it publicly. But that's all happening in the background, and we just continue to follow Trump throughout the film as well. And it just, I don't know, it just feels like there's so much going on, and stylistically, it's like trying to, really put you into the story. But I just feel like a lot of the writing just comes up like a little flat, and I think that's like my biggest issue with everything. I think the character dynamics are well done. I just wish that there was like a little bit more to dig into with the story and with a lot of what's going on. Like, I understand that there is a lot of source material to go off of because there is just so much footage of these people from back in the day, to try and, cover all of that and try to flesh out this story over like 10 years is just really tough. And the other thing too is that, Donald's arc as like this little shy, timid brat boy all the way to the power hungry mogul that he becomes by the end of the film, kind of like a little bit of a quick character arc. I think maybe almost if this was a TV show, this might have played off a little bit better. But the fact that it is in the shape of a film, that it just makes it feel a little rushed. Like everything just happens very quickly. That tends to be sort of the issue with a lot of these biopic style films, especially with celebrities and people who are this well known in pop culture like this. It feels like there is so much in their lives that people want to know about, and like the little intricacies. And to try and cover this much ground, it just doesn't do each little event justice, in my opinion. But overall, like I said, I think I still really enjoyed the film. I would love to see it again. I know it doesn't come out for like another week. I'm really excited to see it again, and just to see if I feel the same way on a rewatch, because it is a little bit of like this enveloping experience when you watch it for the first time. And there's like a lot of events, especially the fact that like a lot of these things happened in real life too. Like a lot of these things are true. And I think it's so interesting to sort of dive into this world that the film lives in. And I also think it's going to be really cool because it's definitely going to be polarizing when it comes out next week too. A lot of people are going to be talking about it. The discourse is going to be interesting, and there's going to be pretty good amount of controversy, I'm sure. And I think this is a film that people should really go see. And, for me personally, I already kind of knew a lot of the story behind this. There's an Andy Warhol cameo because that was going on at this time as well. Like the culture in New York, not only was New York a shithole, but it was also kind of thriving culturally. And that's where a lot of these people really thrived, was in this shithole of a city at the time. You know, no matter what you feel about Trump or about Roy Cohn or about, you know, any of these other characters, I think I would just recommend going into this with like a slightly open mind. It's not going to be like this, you know, hero arc. If you think that's what it is, it's not, but it's not also going to be this, you know, this villain arc biopic either. I think it's really just sort of lives in this interesting space where you're looking at these characters almost through like a test tube, and you're just trying to put the pieces together through this, you know, documentary style. And I think it's interesting to look at it from that perspective, like you're looking at it from the director's perspective, this outsider's perspective on not only these people, but also the system that made them and the media and the idea of, you know, the American dream, if you will. And it's also extremely relevant too. Like I said, like this, it's going to come out a month before the election. And it'll be really interesting to see what the reception of this is going to be in the next month here. So, you know, I would just watch it for that reason. And if you don't know the story, then I think you'll find it very interesting. You probably won't find it all that surprising, but I think it's very interesting. And it's also just kind of like a really fun time. Like the theater that I was in had like a great time. Everybody was laughing. There's a lot of really fun and entertaining moments throughout the film. And there's also some moments that are actually like really sad. And you actually almost, you know, kind of feel sympathy for some of these people, which is a little insane to say. Inherently, if you're going to humanize these people, you have to flesh them out as characters, not only because they're people in real life. And even if a lot of these people are, you know, monsters in their own right, you have to humanize them if you're going to talk about this subject. And I think, you know, inherently, obviously, that's going to bring up controversy. But I think that's really the only way that you could make a film about these people and about this subject. So I think in that way, the film actually succeeded. Overall, those are my thoughts. I know this is kind of like a long-winded review, but there's a lot to dive into about this film. I'm definitely going to have to go see it again. My thoughts could change in like a week or something like that. If something changes drastically for me about it, I might make like a redux review for it. Like, I honestly don't know. It'd be interesting to see what people's reactions to this would be as well. So stay tuned for that. I think overall for this film, for now, I'm going to leave it at a 6 out of 10. We'll see if that changes in like the next week when I watch it again. I just wanted to give my full thoughts on it. You know, I had been talking about it with some other people I know. Once everybody goes and sees it and starts talking about it online, then I'll get like a much better gauge of how people are feeling about it. Be sure to like and subscribe down below. And also, if you guys, you know, wanted to leave your thoughts and comments once the film comes out, or, you know, just what you thought about my personal thoughts on it, go ahead and put that down below. I'm sure you guys will definitely have an interesting discourse about this film, like you guys are having right now with the Megalopolis video. Thank you guys for watching, and I definitely appreciate it, and I will see you guys in the next video.